The night I first saw her was the night the villagers spoke in hushed whispers. Her name was Akosia, a 7-year-old girl with big brown eyes who never smiled. Everyone knew the story. Her father had owed a debt to the village's most feared man, the dwarf known only as Kwaku. But no one knew what happened to Akosia after that. Her father was dead, and the little girl had disappeared. People stopped talking about her after a while, but I never forgot. One cold evening, I was out by the river when I saw her again, grown, standing alone, her hair tangled, eyes wide with something dark, like a shadow had taken over her soul. She looked nothing like the scared little girl I remembered. Years ago, the village was a place of laughter, community, and warmth. But it was also a place where debts were paid in full, no matter the cost. Kwaku, the dwarf, had made a fortune through mysterious ways. He was small in stature, but his heart was said to be just as twisted. People feared him, no one dared to look him in the eye. He kept to himself, living in a small, dark hut near the outskirts of the village, where no one dared to visit. I was there the day Akosia's father made the mistake. He was a good man, but desperate. He had taken a loan from Kwaku for his sick wife, and when he couldn't repay it, he had no choice but to offer something else. The villagers heard him cry out one morning, pleading for help. But it was too late. Kwaku had claimed his debt, and Akosia was the payment. For days, there was nothing but silence from the dwarf's hut. Then the little girl vanished. Nobody knew what Kwaku did to her, and no one dared to ask. It was only after the years passed that I saw her again, looking just as cold as the night I first heard her story. The years had not been kind to Akosia. The once lively girl was now quiet, her spirit crushed by the abuse she'd endured under Kwaku's roof. The villagers whispered that Kwaku had broken her long ago, that she would never be the same. I was one of the few who dared to speak to her. I remember the first time I did. It was a late afternoon, and I saw her sitting by the river, just like before, staring into the water as if it held the answers to all her pain. I approached her slowly. "Akosia?" I asked softly. She didn't look up. I sat beside her, and for a long while, there was nothing but the sound of the flowing water. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," I finally said. "I don't know how anyone could do that to a child." Her voice was like a whisper, barely above the wind. "He's not the man you think he is," she said, her eyes empty as she looked ahead. I didn't understand. What did she mean? Before I could ask more, she stood up and walked away, her figure vanishing into the shadows of the woods, like a memory I couldn't hold on to. The days turned into weeks, and still, I couldn't shake the image of her from my mind. What had happened to Akosia? And why did she say Kwaku wasn't the man I thought he was? I knew I had to find out, and so I made a plan. One night, when the moon was full, I followed her. I knew she wouldn't go back to the village. She never did. So, I followed her through the woods, far past the familiar paths, until I reached the edge of the dark clearing where Kwaku's hut stood. It was quiet, too quiet. The hut was dimly lit by a single candle, and the door was slightly ajar. My heart raced as I approached, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. I waited. It wasn't long before I saw her, Akosia, standing before the door, her hand on the wooden frame. She didn't knock. She didn't even seem to hesitate. Then the door creaked open, and Kwaku appeared. He was smaller than I remembered, but his presence was enough to make the air feel thick with tension. Akosia stepped inside, disappearing from sight. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. I had to know what was going on. I had to understand. But what was I about to witness? Suddenly, the door slammed shut. I froze. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, not knowing whether I should run or stay. The door to Kwaku's hut was shut tight, but my mind raced. What had I just witnessed? Akosia, that girl I'd grown up with, had entered the dark, twisted world of Kwaku once more. But there was something in her eyes, a hint of something different this time, something I couldn't place. I waited for hours, listening to the silence of the night. Nothing. I didn't dare approach. Fear clung to me like the chill in the air. The next day, the village seemed normal, too normal. People went about their business, their voices low and their faces serious, but none of them dared to mention Akosia. Not a single word. I was the only one left who even remembered her. Weeks passed, and things didn't change. Akojua was never seen outside of Kwaka's hut. Sometimes I would hear noises in the night, shouting, muffled crying, but nothing more. No one asked questions. The village had learned long ago to keep its nose out of Kwaka's business. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't forget her. One evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I would find out what was happening inside that hut, even if it meant confronting the dwarf himself. The path to Kwaka's home was overgrown now, barely visible through the thick underbrush. But I knew it well, as it had been the same path we used when we were children. The thought of going there made my stomach churn, but I pressed on. When I reached the clearing, I saw her. Akojua stood at the edge of the hut, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She was staring at the ground, not moving, not speaking. I called out her name softly. Akojua. She flinched but didn't look up. She was trembling. For a moment, I thought she might run, but instead, she turned to face me, her eyes wide with fear. There was no joy in them, no recognition, only coldness. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She took a step closer, glancing back at the darkened doorway of the hut. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to live with him." Her voice was empty, but I could see the pain behind it. "Tell me," I urged. "Please." For a long while, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she spoke, her words falling like stones into the silence between us. "He wasn't always like this," she said, her voice barely audible. "At first, he just kept me in the dark. He would give me food, but I wasn't allowed to leave. He never touched me. But over time, he became different. More angry. More cruel." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. "He would shout at me, call me worthless, but he never let me go. He said it was punishment for my father's death." She paused, the pain in her eyes making me feel sick to my stomach. But then something changed. I leaned in, desperate to hear more. "What changed?" Akojua looked away, as though she couldn't bear to speak it aloud. "He started treating me differently. He started saying I was the only person who could make him feel human again. He began to look at me differently. He said I was the one thing that could make him better." I recoiled, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You mean he?" Akojua nodded, the haunted look in her eyes never leaving her face. "He told me that if I loved him, he could change. If I cared for him, he could be something else. Something good." Her words didn't make sense. Kwako, the cruel dwarf, the one who had taken her as payment, could he really change? "I didn't love him. I couldn't," Akojua whispered. "But I didn't have a choice. Over the years, I learned how to survive. I learned to be good to him. I took care of him, fed him, helped him, but all the while I hated him." The truth settled in like a stone in my chest. She had been trapped in this life for years. She had endured all that pain, forced to serve the man who had stolen her innocence. "What happened then?" I asked, barely able to form the question. Akojua stared at the ground. "Eventually, something happened. Something I never expected. Suddenly, the door of the hut creaked open. Akojua stiffened, her body tensing as though she were preparing for something. Kwaku appeared in the doorway, his eyes sharp as ever. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at us, at her, and then at me. He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, like a predator eyeing its prey. Akojua's face drained of color. "I don't like strangers," Kwaka said, his voice cold, though there was an unmistakable hint of something else in it, something I couldn't place. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move. Akojua glanced at me, her eyes filled with a silent plea. Kwaka stepped forward, his gaze fixed on me. "Leave her be, or you'll regret it," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. But before I could respond, Akojua stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. You need to leave now. It's not safe." I didn't move. I couldn't. Kwaka's cold eyes bore into me like a steel trap, and Akojua's trembling form stood between us. The silence between us felt thick, oppressive, as if the very air was alive with danger. It wasn't the dwarf that scared me. No, it was the look on Akojua's face. It was like she was begging me to leave, not just for my own safety, but for something deeper, something she hadn't said aloud. Go home, she whispered, barely audible. The words felt like a slap to the face. I wasn't about to leave her behind, not now. But something in her tone made me hesitate. I had never seen her like this. There was no defiance, no spark of hope in her eyes, just fear. It made my blood run cold. Before I could respond, Quokka spoke again, this time with a low growl in his voice. You're not welcome here. Leave. Now. His words hit me like a hammer, but I held my ground, trying to mask the terror gnawing at my insides. I wasn't stupid. I knew I couldn't take him on. He was ruthless and dangerous, and Akojua had been under his control for years. But what terrified me the most was how she acted, how she pleaded with me to leave. Akojua turned slowly, her shoulders slumped, and walked toward the door of the hut without another word. Quokka gave one last glance in my direction before he followed her inside. The door slammed shut behind them, and the darkness of the night swallowed them whole. I stood there for a long time, the sound of my breathing the only thing I could hear. What had happened to her? What was she trying to tell me? The question gnawed at me, and I knew that I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know the truth. The next morning, the village was quieter than usual. No one spoke of Kwaku or Akojua. It was as though they had simply disappeared, like ghosts, only to return once in a while with no explanation. I knew then that I had to find a way into that hut. I had to understand what was happening between them. That night, I went back. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the clearing. I crept along the familiar path, my heart racing in my chest. When I reached the edge of Quokka's hut, I didn't hesitate. I slipped into the woods, just beyond the clearing, where I could see the hut from a distance but not be seen. The door was slightly ajar again. The dim glow of a candle flickered inside, casting strange shadows on the walls. I waited, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body on edge. Time seemed to stretch out in the quiet, my heart pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Then I heard something. Footsteps. The door creaked open, and I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. Akojua stepped out first, her face expressionless, her eyes distant. Quokka followed her, walking slowly as though he were savoring the moment. They didn't speak to each other. There was no warmth, no affection between them, just an eerie, silent understanding. I watched as they moved toward the back of the hut. Kwaku went inside for a moment, and Akojua lingered by the door, her face half lit by the candlelight. That was when I saw it. Her hand. It was scarred, the skin on her palms worn and rough, like she had been holding something tight for too long. I could see the marks of the years she'd spent in that cursed place, her spirit crushed under the weight of Quokka's twisted affection. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. It was the change in her eyes. The hollow, empty gaze I had seen before was now gone. Her eyes were cold, no longer fearful, but steely, as though she had made her peace with something dark. I wanted to call out to her, but I couldn't move. I stayed frozen in place, watching as she disappeared into the shadows with Kwaku. It wasn't until the following evening that I learned what had happened inside that hut. I was walking through the village, lost in thought, when I overheard the whispers. At first, they were just murmurs, fragments of conversation that barely caught my attention. But then I heard a name that made my blood run cold. Akojua. It was an old woman sitting outside her home, speaking to her neighbor. Have you seen her today? She looks different. Doesn't she? Different? What do you mean? She's changed. She's no longer the broken little girl. She's something else now. Something else? I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The woman continued. I heard from Quokka's brother that she's been helping him, tending to him, even caring for him. And now, he's changed. I don't know how to explain it, but he's been kinder, more gentle, even almost human. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What had happened between them? How could Akojua, who had once been a victim, be the one to change him? As if on cue, I spotted Akojua walking toward me. But she wasn't the same. Her posture was straighter, her expression more confident. There was no trace of the frightened girl I had once known. She caught my eye and gave a small nod, as if acknowledging my presence. "Akojua," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She stopped but didn't look at me. "You should go back to your home," she said softly. "You don't belong here anymore." "Akojua? What's going on?" I asked, stepping closer. "What did he do to you? How did he change?" Her lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of joy. It was something darker. "He didn't change. Not in the way you think. But I'm different now. You don't understand." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but something in her eyes made me stop. There was no fear in her gaze anymore, only resignation. Before I could say anything more, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the village. And that was when it hit me. Kwaku had changed her. Not just physically or emotionally, but something deeper, something unnatural, something that I couldn't yet understand. The days that followed were nothing like I'd ever known. The village seemed quieter, the air heavier, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was brewing just beneath the surface. But no one spoke about it. The villagers had learned long ago to mind their own business, especially when it came to Kwaku and Akojua. They were no longer the same people I had once known, if they ever had been. I spent my nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything I had seen and heard. Akojua's change was unsettling, but there was something else, something darker, that I couldn't quite understand. She had always been strong, even as a child. But this was something else entirely. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them by staying away. A week after my last encounter with Akojua, I decided to visit her again. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my chest. I had to know the truth. What had happened to her? What had Kwaku done to her? I had to understand how someone could change so completely. That evening, I made my way to the clearing, my feet moving on their own accord. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the village. The wind rustled the trees, and I could hear the distant murmur of voices, but nothing felt right. I felt like I was walking through a dream, one I couldn't wake up from. When I reached the edge of Kwaku's hut, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, just as it had been before. There was no sign of Akojua, but I could hear movement inside. Quiet footsteps, the faint sound of something being shifted. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was happening inside that hut. I pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. The sight made my breath catch. Akojua was there, sitting on a low stool, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look up when I entered, as if she already knew I was there. And Kwaku stood near the fire, his back to me. He was smaller than I remembered, but still imposing. His presence filled the room. Something in the air shifted, like the temperature had dropped. The tension between them was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel like I was intruding on something intimate. But I had to know. I had to understand. Akojua finally spoke, her voice soft, but carrying a weight that made me uneasy. "You shouldn't be here." I stepped back, startled by her words. I need to know what's happening, Akojua. Please." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to Kwaku, who met her gaze with an unreadable expression. He didn't seem angry. If anything, he seemed tired. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice gruff. "You've seen too much already." I swallowed, stepping into the room fully now, ignoring the warning in his voice. "What do you mean? Why are you doing this to her? What happened to the Akojua I knew?" Kwaku's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Instead, Akojua spoke again, this time with a strange calmness that sent chills down my spine. "I'm not the same person anymore," she said, looking up at me with a faint, bitter smile. "And neither is he." I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean? How did he change you?" She shook her head slowly. "It's not just him. It's everything." For the next few hours, they told me their story. It was a tale that I couldn't quite comprehend, but I would never forget. Kwaku spoke first, his voice low and rasping. "I wasn't always like this," he began, looking down at the floor. "Once, I was like everyone else. I had dreams, ambitions. But I was born into poverty, and I had nothing. Nothing but my wits and my ambition. I worked hard, made deals, did things I'm not proud of, but I did them for a reason. I didn't interrupt, but I could feel my heart pounding faster with each word. I became rich, yes, he continued, but at a cost. I alienated people. I pushed them away. I became someone I didn't recognize. And then, when your father owed me a debt, I saw a chance. I could take what was owed to me, and no one would question it. He glanced at Akojua, and for the first time, there was a hint of softness in his eyes. But I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't understand the power of what I was asking for. I took you, Akojua, not realizing what it would do to you, or to me. Akojua sat silently, her gaze fixed on the fire. At first, I hated him, she said, her voice steady but laced with bitterness. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. He kept me locked in that house, fed me scraps, treated me like a servant. It broke me, piece by piece. Kwaka's voice softened, and he looked at her with something like regret. I know. I never meant to hurt you. I was a coward, hiding from my own guilt. But over time, things changed. I changed. Akojua glanced at him, her expression unreadable. He became kinder, but it was too late. He had already taken everything from me, and I was already too far gone. I watched them both in stunned silence. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. This wasn't the story I had imagined. This wasn't the Kwaku I had feared for years. But there was something more, something darker. I've done terrible things, Kwaka said, his voice cracking. But I never wanted anyone to love me for my wealth. I wanted someone to love me for who I truly was. That's why I made her stay, because she was the only one who could save me. Akojua looked away, but I could see the faintest trace of something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Was it compassion, sympathy, or something darker? Suddenly, Kwaka coughed, a painful, hacking cough that rattled his frail body. He staggered back, clutching his chest. Akojua rose immediately, rushing to his side. I'm fine, he muttered, but I could see the sweat on his brow, the pallor of his skin. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Akojua looked at me, her eyes hard. You need to leave. Now. I opened my mouth to protest, but she was already pushing me toward the door. I said, leave. You've seen enough. Before I could say another word, I was out in the cold night air, the door slamming shut behind me. The sound echoed in the stillness, and for a long moment, I stood there stunned. What had I just witnessed? And why did I feel like I had just walked into a trap? The cold air outside was harsh against my skin, but it wasn't the chill that made me shiver. No, it was the weight of the conversation I had just overheard. Kwaka's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was lurking beneath the surface of everything I had seen. I wanted to leave, run away from this madness, and forget I had ever come to that hut. But something inside me kept me there, glued to the spot in front of Kwaka's door. There were too many unanswered questions. Too many strange, unsettling pieces that didn't fit together. Akojua, once so broken and afraid, had changed. And Kwaku, the wicked dwarf who had held her captive, had become something else too. I knew I couldn't go home until I understood it all. I had to know what they were hiding, what was truly going on in that hut. The next day, I couldn't find the peace I was looking for. My mind raced, replaying every moment of the past few days, and the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I knew Akojua. She was strong, more resilient than anyone I had ever met. So how had she been changed so completely by Kwaku? Had he truly broken her spirit, or was there something more sinister at play? By late afternoon, the sun had begun to set, casting a golden glow over the village. I decided to go back to the hut again. It was risky, I knew that, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut, the nagging urge to uncover the truth. When I arrived, the hut was eerily silent. There was no sign of movement inside, and for a moment, I wondered if I was making a mistake. But the curiosity was too strong. I approached the door carefully, ensuring there was no one around. I tried to push the door open, but it was locked. I was about to turn away when I heard a faint voice. Come in? It was Akojua. Her voice was quiet, almost as if she were speaking to herself. but the invitation was clear. I hesitated for a moment, my heart hammering in my chest, before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, and Kwaku was nowhere to be seen. Akojua sat by the fire again, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was staring into the flames, as if lost in thought. I stepped inside slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. "Akojua," I said, my voice unsure. "What's going on? What's happening here?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she raised her eyes to meet mine. There was something cold in her gaze, something distant. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice low. "I told you to leave." "I know," I whispered. "But I can't. I need to understand. Please tell me what's really going on." She stared at me for a long moment. And then, to my surprise, she sighed and stood up. "Sit down," she said, gesturing toward the stool by the fire. "You want to know the truth? Fine. But you need to understand this first. There's no going back after you hear it." I sat down, my nerves taut with anticipation. "I'm listening." Akojua turned her back to me and began to speak, her voice quieter than before. "I've been here for years now, living in this hut, serving him, doing everything he asked. But there was a time, a long time ago, when I wanted to escape, when I wanted to fight him, to run away. But I couldn't. I had nothing, no one to turn to. He had taken me in a way that no one else could understand. But that wasn't the worst part. I watched her, hardly breathing, as she continued. Over time, I realized something. I was becoming just like him. The more I stayed here, the more I changed. And it wasn't just him who was changing. It was me too." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts, before continuing. "Do you remember the way he treated me when I first came here? The cruelty, the harshness, the way he ignored me? At first, I hated him for it. But after a while, something happened. I started to care for him. My stomach dropped. Care for him? After everything he did to you?" She nodded, but there was no trace of emotion in her eyes. "Yes, he was cruel, but not always. He was alone, just like me. And when he needed someone, I was there. I didn't want to be, but I was. He started to change. Slowly but surely he became less monstrous. And she trailed off, her voice faltering slightly. "I began to love him. I couldn't process it. This was too much. Everything I thought I understood about Akojua was unraveling before my eyes. She had been forced into this life, yet she had somehow found love in it. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, Akojua turned sharply to face me, her eyes hard and filled with resolve. "Don't pity me," she said. "You think this is a tragedy. But it's not. It's the way things were meant to be, the way they had to be. You don't understand what he did for me. He gave me a life when no one else would. He gave me a home, but he hurt you," I said, my voice trembling with the force of my words. "You can't just forgive him for that. You don't owe him anything." Akojua shook her head slowly, as if I were the one who didn't understand. "You're wrong. I don't owe him anything. But I chose to stay. I chose him. And for all the pain he caused me, he gave me something I didn't have before. He gave me a purpose, a reason to live." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't understand how she could find peace with such darkness. And then it happened. The door to the hut opened, and Kwaku stepped inside. He looked different. He was thinner, his skin paler than before. His eyes were sunken, and his movements were slow, almost weak. Akojua immediately moved to his side, helping him sit down by the fire. There was a tenderness in her touch that took me by surprise. The coldness was gone. In its place, something softer, something more intimate. "Is he?" I trailed off, unable to finish my question. Akojua didn't look at me. She simply nodded, her voice quiet. "He's sick. Dying, I think." I looked at Kwaku, his face drawn and haggard. The man who had been a monster in my eyes for so long was now just a shadow of his former self, frail and broken. As I stood there, watching them, something inside me twisted uncomfortably. Was this it? Was this the end of it all? Had Akojua truly changed? Or was there still something darker, hidden beneath the surface? I was about to speak again when Kwaku's raspy voice interrupted me. "You should go," he said, barely able to keep his eyes open. I don't have much time left. The next few days felt like a blur of confusion and unease. It was hard to shake the images of Kwaka's fragile state, his frail body, and the way Akojua had cared for him. She was so gentle with him now, like the years of pain and abuse had been wiped away by a single act of kindness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of something bigger, something far more complicated than I could grasp. Despite her calm demeanor, Akojua was clearly holding something back. I could see it in the way she avoided certain questions, the way she hesitated before speaking. It was as if there was a truth buried deep within her, a secret she wasn't ready to share. And yet I knew it had to come out. There was no escaping it. Something about this village, about Kwaku and Akojua, was tying me to a story I couldn't ignore. On the fourth day after Kwaku's decline, I returned to the hut. Akojua was sitting by the fire. As always, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. "You came back," she said, her voice neutral. "I had to," I replied, sitting down across from her. "There's still something I don't understand. What's going on here, Akojua? Why did you stay? Why did Kwaku change?" Akojua sighed, looking away. "You don't get it, do you?" I shook my head, feeling frustrated. "No, I don't." She glanced at me, her eyes tired. "You think I stayed because of him, because of his kindness, don't you?" I didn't answer, but she didn't need one. She already knew. "I didn't stay for him," she said, her voice a low whisper. "I stayed because of what he was hiding, what he promised me. It wasn't love. It was something else." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What are you talking about?" She looked down, her fingers trembling. He wasn't just a dwarf. He wasn't just a man who had lost his way. He was someone else entirely. He had a power, a dark, terrible power. And when he gave me to you, when he locked me away, it was to protect me. I didn't understand. The words were starting to lose their meaning, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean to protect you?" "From what?" "From himself," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "From the curse." Before I could say anything, the door creaked open, and Kwaku hobbled inside. He looked even weaker than before, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He managed to sit down by the fire with Akojua's help, but there was something different about him. His usual gruffness was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost mournful expression. Akojua watched him closely, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What curse?" I asked again, more insistent now. Kwaku closed his eyes, his voice strained. "It's too late. You wouldn't believe me if I told you." I stared at him, my heart racing. I had to know. I had come too far to back away now. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the last of his strength. "I was born into this village just like any other man, but there's something in my blood, something ancient, a gift, or maybe a curse, depending on how you look at it. I didn't ask for it, but it's there. It's always been there." He paused, glancing at Akojua, who nodded as if encouraging him to continue. "When I was young, I discovered the truth. This power, it lets me control things, people, and it lets me take what I need from the earth itself. But it comes with a price. The more I use it, the more I lose of myself. My body, my mind, my spirit. It's why I look the way I do." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I was barely able to comprehend the gravity of his words. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up at me with sad eyes. "Because I couldn't. If anyone found out, they would have killed me. The villagers would have turned on me. They'd see me as a monster, as I really am." Akojua stood up and walked over to him, kneeling by his side. She touched his hand gently. He tried to control it. He tried to hide it, but it was too late. He couldn't stop using it. And that's when everything started to go wrong. I stared at the two of them in shock. How could you live with this? How could you let him? I didn't have a choice. Akojua cut me off, her voice sharp now. He was the only one who could protect me. He promised me that if I stayed, if I helped him, he would give me a future. He gave me power, but only through sacrifice. I was confused. Sacrifice? What do you mean? Her voice was cold now, distant. He needed someone who would love him without asking questions. Someone who wouldn't be blinded by his wealth or his appearance. Someone who could take the power and use it without losing themselves in the process. Quokka looked up at me, his eyes dark with something unspoken. I thought, maybe you could be that person. But I was wrong. I didn't know what to say. I could feel the room closing in on me. I had been a part of this story all along, whether I realized it or not. Akojua had been right. There was no going back. Just then, Quokka coughed violently, clutching his chest. Akojua gasped and rushed to his side, but I could see it. He was beyond help now. The curse had claimed him, just like he had always feared. In his final moments, Quokka's eyes met mine. I tried to make it right, he whispered hoarsely, but it was always too late. And with that, he slumped back against Akojua, his breathing shallow and labored. A few moments passed, and then nothing. The silence in the hut was deafening. Akojua looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and resignation. It's over, she said quietly. He's gone. And now, the curse is mine. I didn't understand. What do you mean? She stood up slowly, her eyes hardening with determination. I have to bury him. And after that, there's something I need to do. Something that can never be undone. As she turned to leave, I stayed rooted to the spot, my mind racing. There was something about her now, something cold, something ancient. I had seen enough to know that this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But one thing was certain. Akojua would never be the same. And neither would I.